All right, ready to dive in. We're tackling the world of law today.
Ooh, sounds intriguing.
It is. You've given us a real mix of sources.
Oh, like what?
Fetal rights, guardians, even stuff about business law, and those crazy animal encounters you hear about sometimes.
Wow, a lot to unpack there. It sounds like you're interested in how law pops up in everyday life.
Exactly. Hoping to make sense of it all, really.
Well, what's interesting is most people don't realize how much these legal things affect us every day.
That's what we're here to uncover.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll be spotting legal stuff everywhere.
Exactly. So maybe we can start with something that always gets people talking, fetal rights.
Okay, sure.
Our sources really dig into this question. Is a fetus legally a person?
Ah, I see where this is going.
And then what does that mean for things like, inheritance?
Yeah, that's where it gets tricky. Legally defining when a fetus is considered born is not as straightforward as you might think. Yeah, some legal opinions say it's when contractions start, but others say it's the moment a baby can breathe on its own.
Wow. That changes those whole due date arguments, doesn't it?
It does.
And it gets more complicated with things like inheritance. One source even mentioned a case where a baby was injured during birth,
Oh, right.
and they got a huge settlement.
See, that case shows something important. Even if a fetus isn't always legally a person, there are still laws to protect their future.
You mean like their right to inheritance?
Exactly, especially if something happens to the mother.
It makes you think how much the law considers those what-if situations.
It does.
Speaking of legal stuff, maybe we can move on to guardianship.
Okay.
We always hear about parental rights, but these sources go deep into what it really means to be a guardian, legally speaking.
It's way more than just being a parent, that's for sure.
Right.
Our sources point out that it could be grandparents, siblings, even community groups stepping in.
It's a big responsibility.
Huge. And it goes way beyond just food and a place to live.
Oh, absolutely.
You're talking managing money, representing the child legally, making sure they get an education.
Yeah, the list goes on. One source even described a case, a really sad one, about elder abuse.
Oh, right, where the guardian totally failed.
And there were serious consequences because of it.
It really highlights that guardianship isn't just a privilege, it's a legal duty. And there are legal repercussions if you don't do it right.
It's interesting how different legal systems approach this whole thing.
Yeah.
Our sources mentioned some recent developments in Chinese law.
Yes. Allowing for more intervention in guardianship, particularly when it comes to the well-being of elders.
It shows how laws are always changing to keep up with society, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, how about we switch gears again? Let's talk about business law.
Okay.
These sources really break down some key concepts, especially that thing about a legal representative in a company.
Ah, yes. That can be confusing.
It's definitely not just a fancy title, is it?
Not at all. It comes with a ton of power and even more responsibility.
So walk me through it. What do they actually do?
Well, the legal representative is basically the face of the company. They sign contracts, manage money, even represent the company in legal battles.
Sounds intense.
It is. If you're ever thinking of taking on that role, pay attention to what our sources say about knowing your limits and understanding that you could be personally liable.
Oh, that's important.
Yes. One source actually had this story. It was kind of funny, but also serious.
What happened?
A company chairman sued his own company.
Seriously, that's wild.
It shows why it's important to know the difference between a legal representative and a corporate representative.
Yeah, it's easy to get those mixed up.
It is, and it matters because the legal representative is personally on the hook for what they do for the company, which can have big consequences.
Makes sense. Knowing those little details could save a lot of trouble later.
For sure.
All right, one more gear shift. How about we explore something a little different? Those legal issues that come up with animals. Yeah, we don't always think about it, but there's a whole legal system around dog bites, property damage caused by animals, all that.
You wouldn't think about it until it's too late.
Exactly.
And the sources point out how important it is to know who's responsible when an animal causes harm. Is it the owner, the person watching the animal?
It probably gets pretty complex.
It does. The laws really get specific. They even break down the difference between human bites animal versus animal bites human.
Whoa, That's legal debate I'd like to see.
Me too.
It shows how these legal things can pop up anywhere.
Absolutely.
But how does all this knowledge actually help our listeners in their daily lives?
Well, that's where it gets empowering. Understanding this legal stuff helps you make better decisions, whether you're signing a contract, dealing with a car accident, or even just seeing a loose dog in your neighborhood.
So it's like having a legal toolbox at the ready.
Exactly.
But with all these different laws and legal jargon, it can feel overwhelming.
It can.
Where do people even start? How do our listeners make these complex legal ideas easier to understand and then actually use them in real life?
Well, our sources talk about breaking down all that legal jargon into plain language.
Okay, which is what we're trying to do here.
Exactly.
It makes sense.
Another good tip is to think about real-world examples, like that company chairman suing his own company.
Oh, yeah.
Seeing how these legal ideas play out in actual situations helps.
It's like learning from someone else's legal battles so you don't have to fight them yourself.
Exactly.
And that reminds me of something else, how legal rights and responsibilities change throughout our lives.
Right.
Our sources talk about how different age groups have different legal statuses and protections.
Yeah, like we were just talking about how a fetus is different legally from a newborn, and then how guardianship comes in for minors.
It's almost like leveling up in a video game. You get new legal abilities and challenges at each stage.
It's a good analogy.
But even as adults, things change, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Starting a business, signing contracts, dealing with property, it all has legal implications.
Absolutely. And planning for the future, too, like with wills and estates.
So much to think about.
There is.
But let's focus on those common legal situations that many people face.
Okay.
What practical advice do the sources give for navigating those tricky waters?
Well, one thing that keeps coming up is the importance of having everything in writing.
Documentation.
Exactly.
Contracts, wills, even just emails and letters.
Yeah.
Having a paper trail can really help if there's ever a dispute.
It's crucial.
That's like creating a legal shield for yourself.
Exactly.
Speaking of shields, let's talk about something that unfortunately seems to be happening more and more these days, workplace harassment.
Okay.
Our sources provide a really thorough look at the legal side of that.
They do. And it's important to remember that legally, harassment is defined pretty broadly.
What do you mean?
Well, it's not just physical attacks or obvious discrimination. It includes anything, verbal or even nonverbal, that makes a work environment hostile or offensive.
So, like what? Give me some examples.
Unwanted advances, offensive jokes, even just creating a threatening atmosphere, those can all count as harassment.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that broad.
It is, and the law protects people from harassment based on all sorts of things, like gender, race, religion, age, disability.
That's good to know.
It is.
It's crucial for making workplaces safer and more respectful for everyone.
Absolutely.
Now, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier, those animal-related incidents.
Okay.
Our sources really get into the legal nuts and bolts of those situations. Dog bites, property damage caused by animals.
It's fascinating how often those laws come down to ownership and responsibility.
Like we talked about before, figuring out who's liable when an animal causes harm can get really complicated.
It can.
And those human bites animal cases we mentioned, those really show how unique these situations can be.
They do.
It makes you realize that you have to be aware of the legal side of things, even in those crazy, unexpected situations.
Absolutely. It's about having a clear system for figuring out disputes and making sure things are fair, even in those strange cases.
Right. So we've covered a lot here.
We have.
Fetal rights, business law, guardianship, those animal encounters. It's clear that law affects pretty much every part of our lives.
Yeah, it really does.
But the big question is, how can we use this knowledge to make smarter legal decisions?
That's the key.
That's where it gets real.
Right, exactly.
And our sources do have some good advice on that.
Like what?
One important thing is understanding your rights, as a consumer, an employee, a citizen.
It's the foundation of protecting yourself.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
It really is. But knowing your rights is just the first step.
What's next? How do people actually use those rights?
Well, the sources emphasize how important it is to get legal help when you need it.
Like hiring a lawyer.
Exactly. They know how to navigate the legal system.
They can guide you and represent you, especially if your rights have been violated or you're in a legal battle.
Exactly.
So don't be afraid to call in the legal experts if you need them.
That's right.
And remember, legal issues don't always have to be these big dramatic events.
Right.
Our sources point out that even in everyday things, signing a lease, negotiating a contract, Dealing with a fender bender, knowing a little bit about the law can help you make better choices.
It's all about being prepared.
It's like having a legal GPS to guide you through life's ups and downs. But what about those times when legal stuff gets mixed up with personal relationships?
Ooh, that's tough.
Like family disputes, arguments with friends, conflicts with people you care about. How do you balance your legal rights with those relationships?
That's a tricky one. Our sources acknowledge that legal stuff often overlaps with very personal matters.
It does.
And in those situations, you have to think about more than just your legal rights.
What else should people consider?
The emotional impact on everyone involved.
Right, because sometimes going to court or getting lawyers involved can really damage relationships.
Exactly. So sometimes finding a solution that keeps those relationships intact might be more valuable than winning.
It's not always about fighting it out then.
Not always.
Sometimes it's about finding a compromise that works for everyone.
Exactly.
That's a good reminder that the law isn't just about rules and punishments. It's about finding solutions that work for real people in real-life situations.
That's what it's all about.
And that brings up another point. The law is always evolving.
It is.
New laws are passed, court decisions set precedents, and society's values change. And all that influences how the law is interpreted and applied.
Absolutely.
So it's important to stay updated and be aware of those changes, right?
It is. The sources highlight how important it is to keep up with legal developments.
How can people do that?
Well, they can read reliable news sources, legal publications, or even talk to legal professionals to stay current.
So it's kind of like a never-ending legal education.
In a way, it is.
But that's what makes it so interesting, right?
It is. It's like the law is alive, constantly changing and adapting.
It really is. Well, folks, we've reached the end of our legal deep dive.
Time flies.
It does. We've explored so much from fetal rights and the responsibilities of guardians to essential business law tips and those crazy animal encounters. We even talked about workplace harassment, which is so important these days.
It's been quite the journey, hasn't it?
It has. And through it all, we've seen how the law isn't just some abstract concept. It really shapes our lives in so many ways.
Often without us even realizing it.
Exactly. So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with this knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
And after this deep dive, you've got a lot more of it. Remember these insights. Use them to make those tough decisions and stand up for yourself and those you care about.
And remember, the learning never stops. Keep being curious, stay informed, and keep exploring this fascinating world of law.
You never know. Maybe one day you'll be the one making the laws that impact us all. Until then, keep those legal lenses sharp.